the man who would not stop believing a modern Don Quixote. A modern Don Quixote. Chapter 1. In a small town off Route 9, the kind of town that exists mostly to be passed through, there lived a man named Alonso Quesada. He was 61 years old. He had worked 34 years at the county records office, filing the deaths and marriages and property lines of people he never met. And when they gave him a cake and a gift card and told him he was free, he discovered that freedom, for a man with no idea what to do with it, is just a very long afternoon. His house was paid off. His wife had passed 4 years earlier. His daughter called on Sundays, which is to say she called most Sundays, which is to say she called when she remembered. And so Alonso Quesada had time, an ocean of it, and into that ocean he poured the only thing he had ever truly loved, which was books. Not the respectable books, not the ones that win prizes or get discussed by people in scarves. Alonso loved the old adventure stories, the paperback heroes, the lone men who rode into ruined towns and set things right, who never filed a form in their lives, who looked at a corrupt world and did not shrug. He had a shelf of them, then a wall, then a spare room, and somewhere in the 3rd year of retirement, the wall of books stopped being a hobby and became a diagnosis. He read about knights and lawmen and wanderers and the last honest sheriff in a dishonest county. He read them morning and night, and at 2 in the afternoon when the light came sideways through the blinds, and slowly, the way rust takes offense, the stories took him. He stopped being able to say where the books ended and the town off Route 9 began. He came to believe, with the total sincerity only a lonely man can manage, that the world was still a place where a single righteous person could ride out and fix it. The neighbors noticed the small things first. He stopped mowing the lawn but began polishing an old cavalry saber he'd bought at an estate sale, sitting on his porch with it across his knees like a man waiting for something. He wrote letters to the newspaper about honor. They did not print them. He watered a dead rose bush every morning faithfully, as though belief alone might bring it back, and when it did not, he decided the bush was being tested, the same as him, and admired it for holding out. Then one gray Tuesday, Alonso Quesada made a decision that would have alarmed anyone who loved him, which was, at that point, a short list. He decided he would become a hero, not in spirit, not as an attitude the way people mean it when they call a man who returns a wallet a hero. Literally. He would take up the old code and go out into the world and right its wrongs, and history, or at least the local paper, would remember him. That no one had asked him to do this did not strike him as a problem. In the books, no one ever asked. That was the whole point. The hero was the one who did not wait to be asked. Waiting to be asked was for the other people, the ones who filed things. He needed a name. Alonso Quesada was a name for a man who filed things. A hero needed a name that sounded like a verdict. He spent 4 days on it, saying candidates aloud to the empty kitchen, and at last settled on one that felt, to him, like putting on armor. From that morning he would be Don Quixote. He was not sure where he'd gotten it. It had surfaced from some deep shelf of his reading, and it fit, and that was enough. He said it to the mirror in his most solemn voice, and the mirror, wisely, said nothing back. A hero needs a horse. Alonso had a 1998 sedan the color of an old bruise, with 190,000 miles on it, and a check engine light that had been on so long he thought of it as company. Any reasonable man would have called it a car with a year left in it, if that. Alonso looked at it a long time and decided it was a noble steed that had simply been waiting, as he had, for a purpose. He named it Rocinante. The name means, more or less, a broken-down nag that used to be something. Alonso either did not know this or did not care. He chose to hear it as destiny. This is a rare talent, hearing destiny where others hear a failing transmission, and it was perhaps the one true talent he had. And a hero needs a companion. Heroes in the books always had one, some plain and loyal soul to carry the water and say the sensible things nobody listens to. Alonso landed on a man named Sancho, 2 doors down. Sancho was a heavy-set, good-natured man in his 50s who had lost his warehouse job when the warehouse became a distribution center, and the distribution center decided it preferred robots, which do not take breaks or age or ask for anything. Sancho had a wife tired of him being home and a stack of bills that grew like something alive in the kitchen drawer. And when Alonso offered him a job, an adventure, with a salary paid out of future rewards, Sancho did the arithmetic and concluded that a delusional retiree was, at that moment, the best offer on the table. He didn't believe a word of it, but the man had a car that ran, more or less, and a full tank, and Sancho had learned long ago that you can follow someone a good distance without believing in them. Half the country works that way, he figured. At least this one bought lunch. So what do we do exactly? Sancho asked in the driveway. We restore what has been lost, said Don Quixote, gripping the wheel as though it might buck. Restore what? Justice, honor, the old code. Sancho looked at the check engine light, glowing like a small orange god. And there's money in that. There is glory in that. He got in anyway. He told himself it was for the free lunches, told himself he'd bail in a week. He would tell himself many things over the coming days, each less convincing than the last. They pulled onto Route 9 with the windows down, because the air conditioning had died during the term of a President Alonso could no longer name. The town rolled past, the gas station, the shuttered diner, the church whose sign had said God answers ni mail for as long as anyone could remember, the other gas station. And then there was only the road, gray and indifferent, lined with the ordinary machinery of the modern world. Alonso sat up very straight and felt, for the first time in 4 years, that his afternoon had finally ended. Somewhere out there, the world was broken and waiting. He had never been so certain of anything, and certainty, he was about to learn, is the most dangerous horse a man can ride. Rocinante was only the second most dangerous. He did not notice Sancho already checking the bus schedule on his phone. The road stretched on, and on the horizon, tall and white and turning slowly in the wind, stood the first of the giants. Chapter 2. The giants stood in a long row along the ridge, tall and white and slow, their great arms turning against a flat gray sky. There were perhaps 40 of them, spaced evenly across the high ground where the wind never stopped, and from a distance they had the terrible patience of things that have stood a long time and intend to go on standing after everyone watching them is gone. Don Quixote slowed Rocinante to a crawl and stared up at them with the expression of a man who has finally been shown proof that he was right about everything. There, he said quietly, there they are. Sancho leaned forward. Wind turbines. Giants. Wind turbines, Sancho said again, in the patient voice of a man correcting a child who has pointed at a cow and called it a horse. For electricity. My cousin worked out here a season. They put in like 60 a couple years back. There was a town meeting. Somebody threw a chair. But Don Quixote was no longer listening, because listening was not what heroes did at moments like this. He saw the slow turning arms and saw menace in them, some vast grinding machinery that took the honest wind of the world and turned it into profit for men no one ever met. He saw giants because he needed giants, and need, in a certain kind of man, is stronger than eyesight. Those are not machines, he said. Those are the great oppressors of this valley. Look how they take what belongs to everyone, the free wind God gave to every man alike, and grind it into gold for their distant masters. Look how they turn and never tire and never once ask the people below whether they consent to be shadowed by such things. That's kind of the point of them, Sancho offered. They run all the time, that's efficiency. That is exactly what a giant would want you to believe. Sancho opened his mouth, considered the shape of the argument, and closed it. There was a kind of argument you could not win, and he was learning to recognize the early signs of it the way a farmer recognizes a color of sky. Don Quixote put Rocinante in park in the middle of the access road, threw open the door and stepped into the wind. It hit him full in the face, cold and clean and howling down off the ridge, and to him it was not weather. It was the breath of the enemy. He drew the saber from the back seat, held it up so the gray light ran along the blade, and turned to Sancho with his eyes bright and terrible. "Stay back. This is not your fight. If I fall, tell them I did not shrug." "Tell who?" "Anyone." And then Alonso Quesada, 61 years old, 34 years a filer of records, ran up the slope toward the nearest giant, saber raised, shouting a battle cry he had rehearsed in the shower that morning. His knees hurt. The grass was slick. The wind took his hat almost at once and carried it off across the field like a small brown animal escaping, and he did not stop for it, because heroes do not stop for hats. Sancho got out of the car, mostly to see how this would end. The turbine did what turbines do. It turned. It did not notice him. It had never noticed anything in its life and would not begin now, and there was something almost unbearable in the sight of the small shouting man laboring up the hill toward the enormous indifferent thing, while the great white arm swept down through its slow eternal circle with no more malice and no more mercy than the hour hand of a clock. He reached the base. He was breathing hard. Up close the tower was wider than his house and went up and up until looking at the top made him dizzy, and the blades, so slow from the road, came down through the air with a low heavy womb he felt in his chest. For one honest moment he would never admit to afterward, Alonso Quesada understood exactly what he was looking at. A machine, very large. He was a man with an old sword and a bad hip, and he was spectacularly wrong. The moment passed. It always did with him. That was his tragedy and his gift in equal measure. "Coward," he shouted up at it, "fight me on level ground." He swung the saber at the base. It rang off the steel like a struck bell. The shock went up his arm into his teeth, and he dropped the sword and sat down hard in the wet grass, and above him the blade swept down, womb, and came around again, patient as the tide. Sancho climbed the hill, retrieved the sword, retrieved the hat from a fence, and stood over his fallen employer, who was cradling his wrist and glaring up at the enemy with undimmed hatred. "You okay? He cheated. He's a turbine. A sorcerer turned him into a turbine at the last moment to rob me of my victory. It's an old trick." He stopped, hearing how it sounded, and then, because he was who he was, decided it was true anyway. "The point stands. I struck the first blow. They know now that someone is willing." Sancho helped him up. It took both of them and a while. Going down the hill, Don Quixote leaning on his shoulder, sword dragging, hat crushed on at an angle, Sancho felt something he had not expected, not respect exactly, closer to what you feel watching a dog bark at the ocean. The ocean will win. The dog does not know this, or knows it and barks anyway, and there is a terrible small dignity in the barking that has nothing to do with whether it is wise. "Come on," Sancho said. "There's a diner at the exit. I'm buying." Then he remembered his situation. "You're buying." They drove down off the ridge with the wind pushing the car, and behind them the 40 giants turned in their long, indifferent row, having defeated the only man in the valley who ever thought to challenge them, and not knowing it, and not capable of knowing it, which was, Don Quixote thought later in the diner booth with a bag of ice on his wrist, the very definition of a giant. A thing so large it does not know you are there. He wrote it on a napkin. It was the first true thing he had learned since leaving home, and it had cost him a wrist and a hat, which is roughly the going rate for a true thing. The waitress brought 2 coffees and asked if they'd been up at the wind farm. "People went up to take pictures," she said. "We went up there," Don Quixote said gravely, "to take a stand." "Okay, hun," she said, and refilled his cup, because she had worked the counter off Route 9 for 19 years and had learned to let a man be whatever he needed to be, at least until the check came. Chapter 3. That night they took a room at a motel called the Starlight, whose sign had lost the T so that it promised, to anyone driving past, a starly. Sancho took the bed nearest the door out of an instinct he could not have explained. Don Quixote sat by the window with the curtains open, looking out at the parking lot and the dark shape of the ridge beyond it, where he knew the giants still turned, and he could not sleep, and in the way of men who cannot sleep he began to talk. "You think I'm a fool," he said. Sancho, who did think this, said nothing, which is its own kind of answer. "It's all right, my daughter thinks so too. The neighbors, the man at the hardware store who sold me the polish for the sword, I saw his face. They all think the same thing, that an old man read too many books and lost his grip." He turned the crushed hat over in his hands. "But let me tell you what I think, and then you can decide who has lost his grip. I filed papers for 34 years. Do you know what I filed? I filed the record of everything that happened to everyone in that county, and do you know what happened to them? Nothing. Nothing happened to them. They were born and they got a number, and they married and got a number, and they bought a house and got a number, and they died and got a last number, and I filed it, and that was the whole of it. Not one of them ever rode up a hill against something too big to beat. Not one. They were reasonable their whole lives. They mowed their lawns and paid their notes and never once made a fool of themselves, and then they died, and I filed it, and the drawer closed, and that was a life. 34 years I watched reasonable men vanish into a drawer." Sancho lay in the dark and listened. He had not expected the fool to have an argument. Fools generally didn't. That was supposed to be the comfort of them. "So I decided," Don Quixote went on, quieter now, "that I would rather be a fool who rode up the hill than a reasonable man in the drawer. I know what the turbine is. I knew it when I hit it. I felt it in my teeth. It's a machine, and I'm an old man, and there is no sorcerer and no giant, and I'm going to keep saying there is, because the day I stop saying it is the day I go in the drawer while I'm still breathing. That's the part they don't understand. They think I can't tell the difference. I can tell the difference. I'm choosing. A man is allowed to choose the story he dies inside of. It's the only thing they can't file." For a long moment neither of them spoke. Outside, a truck went by on Route 9 and its lights crossed the ceiling and were gone. "That's the most sense you've made since I met you," Sancho said finally, "and it's also completely insane." "Both things are usually true," said Don Quixote, "of anything worth saying." He lay down then, hat on the nightstand, sword against the wall, and slept better than he had in 4 years, the sleep of a man who has finally found a hill worth losing on. And Sancho lay awake a while longer than he meant to, doing arithmetic of a different kind than usual, the kind that doesn't come out even, and he did not check the bus schedule, and he told himself it was because it was late. Chapter 4. Word travels in strange ways along a state road. By the time they reached the next town, a place called Harmon that had a single traffic light and a diner and not much reason to slow down for either, the story had already arrived ahead of them, the way stories do, mutated and improved in transit. A man at the wind farm had attacked a turbine with a sword. Some said he'd been arrested. Some said he'd climbed one. One version had him chaining himself to the base in protest, which was the version the local blog ran, because it was the version that could be understood, and people prefer a story they can understand to one that is true. Don Quixote read the blog post on Sancho's phone in the diner and was displeased. "It says here I was protesting," he said. "I was not protesting. Protesting is what reasonable men do when they've already agreed to lose. I was fighting." "They spelled your name wrong too," said Sancho, who had noticed that the comments were less kind than the article and was trying to keep the phone angled away. But it was too late because someone in the diner had recognized them. The sword was hard to miss, propped in the booth like a third customer, and word went around the room in the low electric way it does, and soon there was a small crowd, and the crowd wanted things. This is the part the books never prepared him for. The books ended at the charge up the hill. They did not show what happened when the hill had a comment section. A young man came over first, filming, holding the phone up between them like a lantern. "You're the turbine guy. Can you say the thing? Do the thing where you call it a giant." "It is a giant," said Don Quixote with dignity. "That's amazing. Say it again, I wasn't recording." An older woman wanted him to fight the county over her property assessment. A man in a feed cap wanted him to know he'd been saying the same thing about the turbines for years, and proceeded to say a great many things about the turbines that were not the same at all, that were in fact about a grievance so specific and so personal that even Don Quixote, who could find a giant in anything, could not find one in it. A teenager wanted a photo and then, having gotten it, wanted to know if the sword was real, and when told it was, lost interest, because a real sword you cannot do anything with is less interesting than a fake one you can. And underneath all of it, running beneath the crowd like a current, was the thing Don Quixote could not name but Sancho could, because Sancho had been poor his whole life and knew the sound of it. The crowd did not love him. The crowd was using him. He was, for one afternoon in a diner in Harmon, a thing that had happened, a break in the day, a man they could point at and feel briefly larger by comparison, and tomorrow he would be a story they told that started with "You should have seen this guy." They did not want him to win. If he won, the story ended. They wanted him to keep charging up the hill forever so they would always have something to watch. Sancho watched his employer straighten under the attention like the dead rose bush might have if watering had ever worked, and felt something cold move through him because he understood for the first time that the giants were not the danger. The giants didn't care. The turbine would never hurt Don Quixote. It didn't know he was there. It was the crowd that would hurt him. The crowd knew exactly where he was. The crowd would keep him charging up the hill until it killed him, and then it would film that too. "We should go," Sancho said. "They need me," said Don Quixote. "They need something to look at. It's not the same." But the man had waited 4 years and 34 before that to be needed, or to feel it, and he could not tell the difference now between being needed and being watched. And this is a confusion that is not unique to fools, and is in fact the great confusion of the age, and it had simply taken a fool to make it visible. He stood in the diner in Harmon with his crushed hat and his ringing wrist and his sword, and he told the crowd he would ride on, that there were greater giants ahead, that no honest wind would be ground into gold while he drew breath. And the crowd loved it the way you love a firework, which is to say for exactly as long as it is going up and not 1 second after it comes down. They filmed him leaving. Rocinante would not start on the first try or the second, and the crowd filmed that too, and it was the part that got the most views later, the heroic exit that would not turn over, the check engine light glowing in the dashboard while the great knight of Route 9 twisted the key and pumped the gas and said to no one, "She's temperamental. All great steeds are." On the third try she caught, and they pulled out under the single traffic light of Harmon, and behind them the crowd was already turning back to their coffee, the show over, the day resumed, and not one of them would have said they had done anything unkind, because they hadn't exactly, and that was the worst of it. Cruelty you can fight. It's the ones who mean no harm and cause it anyway in their thousands, looking through a small bright screen, that there is no charging up the hill against. Sancho drove. Don Quixote had insisted, given the wrist. In the passenger seat, the old man watched the town slide away and said, after a while, in a voice with something new in it, something that had not been there at the wind farm, "They didn't want me to win." "No," said Sancho gently, because there was no kindness in lying about it now. "They wanted me to keep losing where they could see." "Yeah." Don Quixote was quiet for a mile. Then he said, "Good, let them watch then. A man who has already decided to lose can't be made to lose. There's nothing left in me to take." But it did not come out the way it had at the motel. At the motel it had been a choice, made in the dark, freely. Here it had the sound of a man talking himself back into a house he had just seen, for one moment from the outside and had recognized and did not want to have recognized. And Sancho drove and said nothing, and the road went on. Chapter 5. The one who paid for it in the end was not Don Quixote. It rarely is. The ones who pay are the ones standing nearby who never signed up for anything. Her name was Dulcinea, or that is what Don Quixote called her, having decided somewhere back on Route 9 that a knight must have a lady to whom his deeds are dedicated, and having selected, with the sublime unfairness of the delusional, a woman he had met exactly once. Her actual name was Alonso Lorenzo. She ran a farm supply store outside a town called Del Rio, and she had sold Don Quixote a length of chain and a padlock some years back, before any of this, when he was still just Alonso Quesada who filed things, and she did not remember him at all. This did not trouble Don Quixote. In the books, the lady never had to remember. That was, if anything, part of the arrangement. He announced, in the parking lot of the farm supply store, that all his deeds were dedicated to the fair Dulcinea del Toboso, and that he had come to lay his victories at her feet. Alonso Lorenzo, who was 58 and had run the store alone since her husband left, and had a bad knee and a delivery, she was waiting on and no time at all for the kind of thing that was now happening in her parking lot, looked at the old man with the sword and the crushed hat and the second man hovering behind him with an apologetic expression, and she said, "Sir, I think you have me confused with somebody." "Never," said Don Quixote. "I could not confuse you with anyone in the world." "That's the problem," she said. "I'm not anyone in the world. I'm a lady with a store and a bad knee and a truck that's late." But she said it not unkindly, because she had also seen the young man filming from a car across the lot, the same way the crowd in Harmon had filmed, and she understood before Don Quixote did that she had just been drafted into something, that her parking lot was now a stage, that whatever she said next would be a clip. This is how it spread to her. She had not charged up any hill. She had sold a length of chain to a stranger years ago and forgotten it, and now her face was in the video, and the video was titled with her name spelled the way the blog had spelled it, wrong, and the comments were about her, a woman who had done nothing but stand in her own parking lot and be, for a moment, the thing a delusional man had pointed at. Some of the comments were cruel in the ordinary way. Some were cruel in the newer way, the way that pretends to be concerned. All of them were about a woman who did not exist, the fair Dulcinea, and none of them were about Alonso Lorenzo, who did, and who now could not go to the diner in Del Rio without someone doing the voice. Sancho saw it happen and he thought about his own wife at home, tired of him, and he thought, this is what the man does, not on purpose. He would never on purpose. He points at things and calls them what he needs them to be. A nag becomes a steed, a turbine becomes a giant, a tired woman with a store becomes a lady in a tower, and mostly it costs only him the wrist, the hat, the dignity. But sometimes he points at a person and a person is not a turbine. A person notices. A person has a store to run and a knee that hurts and now a name spelled wrong under a video she never asked to be in. The steed and the giant can't be hurt by being renamed. Only the people can. "We have to fix this," Sancho said to Don Quixote that evening in the truck in a voice harder than he had used before. "You put that woman in something. You didn't mean to, but you did, and she didn't get a choice, and you have to fix it." And for the first time since Route 9, Don Quixote did not have a speech. He sat with the sword across his knees and the crushed hat in his lap, and he looked, for a moment, not like a knight, and not like a fool, but simply like an old man who had wanted so badly to matter that he had forgotten other people were real in the same way he was, which is the oldest mistake there is, and the one no code in any book has ever cured. "I only wanted," he began and stopped, because he could not finish it in a way that would be true. "I know what you wanted," Sancho said. "Everybody wants that. It doesn't buy you her parking lot." The old man was quiet a long time. Then he said, "Turn the truck around." "To where?" "To Del Rio, to the lady, not Dulcinea." He said the real name carefully. The way you handle something you have finally understood is fragile. "To Alonso Lorenzo. I owe her an apology in her own name, and I am going to give it to her out loud where the camera can see, so that whatever they do to my name they leave hers alone." And Sancho, who had gotten in the car for the free lunches, and stayed for reasons he still could not have filed under any heading he'd recognize, turned the truck around. Chapter 6. They drove through the night back toward Del Rio, Rocinante complaining the whole way, the check engine light burning steady as a votive. Don Quixote did not sleep and did not talk. He was rehearsing, Sancho could tell, but not a battle cry this time. Something harder to say than a battle cry. An apology in a person's real name is the one speech the books never gave him, and he had no template for it. And so he was building it himself, word by word, in the dark, which is the only way anyone ever learns to say it. They reached the farm supply store a little after dawn. Alonso Lorenzo was already there, unloading the delivery truck that had finally come, and when she saw the bruise-colored sedan pull in, she set down the box she was carrying and put her hands on her hips in the universal posture of a woman who has decided she will not be having any more of this today. But the young man with the phone was there too. Of course he was. He had followed the story to its source, the way they do, camping in the parking lot for the next clip. And when Don Quixote stepped out of the car, the phone came up like a reflex red light on. And this was the moment. And Don Quixote knew it was the moment. And Sancho watched him see the camera and understand that everything he was about to say would be public, would be clipped, would be watched by the crowd that did not love him. And he watched the old man decide to do it anyway. That was the charge up the hill. Sancho understood it now. The turbine had been the rehearsal. This was the real one, the same act exactly. An old man running at something too big for him with no chance of winning and no illusion left that he could. Except this time the giant was not a machine that couldn't feel him coming. This time the giant was the crowd, and the crowd could feel him coming, and the crowd was going to be there for every second. Don Quixote took off the crushed hat. He held it against his chest. He walked across the parking lot to Alonso Lorenzo, past the camera, and he stopped a respectful distance away, and he spoke, and he did not perform. "My name is Alonso Quesada," he said. "Not the other name, that one. I want it on the record because I spent 34 years keeping records, and I know that the name is the part that lasts. A few days ago I stood in this lot and I called you a lady in a tower, Dulcinea. I made you into a story to hang my foolishness on, and I did it without asking you. And because of me, your name, your real name, is under a video now, spelled wrong, with strangers saying things about a woman who isn't you and never was. I did that. Not a sorcerer, not a giant, me. An old man who wanted so badly to be inside a story that he forgot the people around him were not scenery. You are not Dulcinea. There's no such person. You're Alonso Lorenzo. You run this store alone. Your knee hurts. Your truck was late. And none of that is beautiful in the way I needed things to be beautiful. And all of it is real in a way I have not been for 4 years. And I'm sorry, out loud, in your name where they can see." He turned to the camera directly for the first and only time. "Her name is Alonso Lorenzo. Spell it right. Whatever you do to mine, and you can do what you like to mine, you leave hers out of it. She never charged up any hill. I did, put it on me." And then he put the hat back on, and he turned and he walked back to the car, and it was, by every measure that the crowd used, a terrible piece of content. There was no fight in it. Nobody called anything a giant. It could not be clipped into anything satisfying because it refused to be about the thing everyone had come to watch. It was just an old man saying a true thing in a parking lot, plainly, and taking the cost of it onto himself. And there is no crueler fate for a moment than to be true and unwatchable at the same time. The video of the apology got almost no views. The video of the car not starting had gotten 40,000. Alonso Lorenzo stood with her box at her feet and did not say anything for a while. Then she said, "You could have just called and taken it down." "I don't know how to take it down," Don Quixote admitted. "I don't understand how any of it works. I only know how to stand in the place where I did the wrong and say so." He almost smiled. "It's an old method. It doesn't scale." She looked at him a moment longer, this ridiculous old man in his crushed hat, and something in her face moved, not much but enough. "Alonso Quesada," she said, trying the real name, getting it right. "Go home. You're going to hurt yourself out here. Or somebody worse than me is going to be in your next video, and they won't have a store to go back into when you leave." "I know," he said. and Sancho, standing by the car, heard in it that he did know, finally, all the way down, and that the knowing had cost him more than the wrist and the hat and the dignity combined. Because the one thing a man like Alonso Quesada cannot survive is seeing clearly, and he had just done it twice in one morning, on purpose, out loud, where the camera could see. They got back in the car. Rocinante did not start on the first try. The young man filmed it. On the third try she caught and they pulled out of the lot, and behind them Aldonza Lorenzo picked up her box and carried it into the store and went back to her life, which the story had touched and would now, slowly, release, the way water releases a stone it has been shaping, indifferent to whether the stone remembers being held. Chapter 7. They did not go home right away. Don Quixote asked, in a smaller voice than Sancho had heard from him, if they might drive a little first, nowhere in particular, and Sancho, who had somewhere along the way stopped keeping the arithmetic entirely, said sure. They drove west because the road went west. The wind farm was behind them now, and around noon they passed another ridge with another row of turbines on it, a different 40 giants turning against a different flat sky, and Sancho slowed without being asked, and waited to see what the old man would do. Don Quixote looked at them a long time through the cracked windshield. "Giants?" Sancho asked. He was not mocking, he genuinely wanted to know which man he was driving. And Alonso Quesada looked at the turbines, and Sancho watched him try, watched him reach for it, watched him want with his whole worn-out heart to see the giant standing there the way he had a week ago, when certainty was the most dangerous horse he could ride, and he had ridden it gladly. But the apology in the parking lot had taken something. Seeing clearly is a door that does not close again once you've walked through it, no matter how cold it is on the other side. "Turbines," he said finally, and the word cost him everything. "They're turbines." And that not the wrist and not the hat and not the crowd was the wound the story had been driving at the whole time. Not that the world defeated him. The world couldn't defeat him. The turbine never knew he was there. What defeated him was that he had, for the sake of a woman's name spelled right, chosen to see the world as it was, and a man cannot see the world as it is and go on charging up hills. And so the charging was over and he knew it, and the knowing sat in the car with them like a third passenger, quiet, permanent. They drove on. "You know what the funny thing is," Sancho said after a while, because the silence needed a floor put under it. "Back there, the apology, that was the bravest thing I've seen anybody do, realer than the sword. You ran at something that could actually hurt you and you knew it could, and you did it in a person's name instead of your own. That's the real version of the whole thing you were pretending to be." He kept his eyes on the road. "You were never a knight when you were fighting turbines. You were a knight for about 90 seconds in a parking lot in Del Rio. Nobody watched. It still counts. It counts more." Don Quixote didn't answer for a long time. Then he said quietly, "Write that down." "I don't have a napkin." "Remember it then, somebody should." They came, toward evening, back to the small town off Route 9, past the other gas station, past the church whose sign now said something different that neither of them read, past the shuttered diner, and they pulled into the driveway of the house with the unmowed lawn and the dead rose bush, and Rocinante shuddered and coughed, and as if she too had understood that the adventure was over and there was no further reason to hold herself together, died in the driveway and did not start again, then or ever. And Don Quixote sat behind the wheel of the dead steed for a moment with his hands in his lap. "She got us home," he said. "She did," Sancho agreed. "That's more than the brochure promised." The old man went inside. He put the sword in the closet, not thrown down, not renounced, just put away, the way you put away a thing you might want to look at again but will not use. He got a glass of water. And then, out of 34 years of habit, or out of something better than habit, he went out to the dead rose bush with the glass and he watered it faithfully, the way he always had, knowing now exactly what it was, a dead bush, in dry ground, that no amount of water would bring back, and watering it anyway. Not because he believed it would bloom. He had lost the ability to believe that on a ridge outside Del Rio. He watered it because a man is allowed to choose the small tending he does in the evening, and no clear sight and no crowd and no camera can take from him the one thing that was always, underneath the giants and the lady and the code, the actual point, that you can know a thing is hopeless and be gentle with it anyway, and that this, and not the sword, was the knighthood the whole time. Sancho watched from the driveway. Then he walked the 2 doors down to his own house, where his wife was and where the bills were, and where the ordinary, unbeautiful real things of his life were waiting, and he found to his surprise that he was glad to go to them, that a week of chasing giants had taught him the one thing the old man had never quite learned in time, that you do not have to make the tired woman into a lady, or the nag into a steed, or the turbine into a giant, to find that they are, exactly as they are, enough to come home to. Behind him, in the blue evening, an old man stood watering a dead rose bush in a town that existed mostly to be passed through, and did not look up, and did not perform, and was, for the first time in the whole story, and for no audience at all, entirely himself. The end.